Chapter 4: Three Adversaries: Leftist Preacher, Reckless King, Pitiless Emperor. Of the important historical figures in the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah, who preached from at least 736 to 701, is one of the most shadowy. His ideas and character are both difficult to understand. Upon first venturing into the early section of the book of Isaiah, readers may wonder of the prophet's outlandish traits. Witness his outright pessimism in predicting doom. Witness, too, his description of himself walking about Jerusalem naked and barefoot for 3 years, an image that has inspired generations of New York cartoonists to spoof modern would-be prophets as wild-eyed, underdressed folk wandering about with placards saying, "Repent." This was his way, Isaiah says, of warning against Judah's joining the anti-Assyrian rebellion of 713. That was led by the Philistine city of Ashdod. The prophet said that he intended his nakedness to serve as a preview of how the Assyrians would strip the vanquished rebels of their clothing and march them off as prisoners of war. Especially perplexing was some statements by Isaiah on Sennacherib's invasion that are glaringly contradictory. In the first period leading up to the aggression, Isaiah had insisted that Yahweh would use Assyria as an instrument of his own anger to punish Judah for its faithlessness. Then, at the last minute, the prophet appears to change his mind, predicting that Jerusalem would emerge unscathed. In Isaiah 31, this change is particularly jarring. That text insists that Jerusalem's defenders will all perish together. Yet, the very next sentence trumpets that Yahweh himself will help them and will fight upon Mount Zion. Yahweh, the text goes on to say, will protect and deliver Zion, and the Assyrians shall flee. Had Isaiah based his prediction on the Assyrian invasion's failure purely on political and military analysis, one might understand how changing circumstances could have made him reconsider his prediction. But this was not a political pundit's change of mind. This was a prophet's U-turn, a deeply rooted religious conviction. Nowhere does the book of Isaiah offer an explanation of this dizzying reversal, and it is easy for readers to assume that the prophet was theologically flighty, perhaps even mentally erratic. Anyone seeking to understand the historical or religious context of the book of Isaiah runs into two obstacles. The first is the problem of chronology. The prophet has much to say about three different crises involving Assyria. Unfortunately, the passages in question do not disclose explicitly to which of these crises they refer. The prophet's formal utterances, known as oracles, are usually at least a half dozen verses in length, and often much more. The ancient editors of the Bible have simply spliced these oracles together without regard for date or obvious logic. Thus, an Assyria-related oracle that one scholar says is probably based on events in the months leading up to the siege of 701 BC may appear in the text just ahead of an oracle that the scholar says referred to an Assyrian attack on Ashdod 713. As well, a passage that deals with events immediately after the lifting of the siege 701 bobs up before either of the others. There is moreover little anonymity on these identifications. Countering one scholar's confident insistence that a passage refers to Sennacherib's invasion will be another scholar's equal assured declaration that the oracle alludes to an earlier threat, adding to readers' frustration in that many of these biblical experts give no adequate reason for disagreeing with each other. A rule of thumb I try to adopt the consensus position on questions of dating and authorship. When departing from that, I will explain why. The second obstacle is the matter of authenticity. The prophet Isaiah is clearly not the author of many passages in the book of Isaiah. Almost all scholars agree that the book of Isaiah is the work of several different authors living at different times, although overarching themes give their work coherence. Most of the chapters 1 through 39 are generally attributed to the first Isaiah, that is, the prophet of the 8th century BC, and the one who is pertinent to this book, chapter 40 to 55, along belong to the second Isaiah, sometimes also called Deutero-Isaiah, after the Greek word for second, who is commonly supposed to have lived during the exile of the 6th century BC. Many scholars say that the third Isaiah, or Tritio Isaiah, composed chapters 56 to 66. This section deals mostly with the post-exilic period of the late 6th century. Within the triptych, further divisions occur. Thus, in the first Isaiah, chapters 36 to 39, which deal with Hezekiah's reign, appear to be lifted almost holus bolus from 2 Kings 18 to 20, while the so-called apocalyptic section, consisting of chapters 24 to 27, may be the latest part of the entire book. As well, the author of 2nd Isaiah, sometimes deemed to have composed chapter 35, an uplifting poem full of religious hope that has, for unknown reasons, found its way into the so-called 1st Isaiah segment. One can appreciate why the University of London's Ronald Clement, whose Isaianic research is exceptionally penetrating, describes the book of Isaiah in its entirety as one of the most complex literary structures of the entire Old Testament. This is the simple part of the authenticity puzzle. What is hard is detecting which of the many remaining portions of chapters 1 through 39 either belong to the real first Isaiah or were composed after his lifetime by the prophet's disciples or by later biblical redactors, as the canon's editors are often called. Scholars agree that these later anonymous contributors tried to add to the original prophet's religious insights by updating them or amplifying them in ways that they saw appropriate, but scholars often disagree in determining which verses are insertions. The portion of the book of Isaiah called First Isaiah, in other words, a jumble of ambiguities, is in other words a jumble of ambiguities. A curious person cannot even begin to understand it without referring to recondite books, articles in scholarly journals. And even when one does this, the experts' contradictory decipherments can still make for confusion. Having gone through this exercise, many take on Isaiah is now having gone through this exercise, my take on Isaiah is now very different from the slightly mad scourge whom I've perceived in my first reading. Once one grasped the catastrophic reprisals that Assyria was capable of inflicting upon rebellious vassals, Isaiah's warning of doom seems less shrilly alarmist than soberly realistic. As for his naked portrayal of POWs, Assyrian bas-reliefs unearthed in the last 150 years show that indeed these invaders disrobed captive soldiers to humiliate them, and Isaiah attempted to dramatize Judahite combatants' similar fate may have been an unabashed example of what today is known as street theater, an effort to make his message vivid and accessible to everyone, not just the royal court. Isaiah's nakedness, some historians conjecture, not unreasonably, would not have been total. Here's another enigma about Isaiah. No one knows how his statements, as well as those of most other biblical prophets, came to be written down. The common premise is that the prophets were not writers but preachers. Many scholars assume that the prophets' own disciples wrote down their utterances, but how this process would have worked is unclear. Were the disciples scribbling down statements as they were delivered? Were they writing down the statements sometime after they were made, relying on memory? In those pre-bullhorn days, it may have been hard for a public speaker to be nuanced, and even if he were, the scribes may not have jotted down every word, they retained the essence. Whatever the process of transcribing Isaiah's thoughts, it was imprecise, and this is another reason for being wary of certain particular statements ascribed to him. But how about the most important puzzle of all? What explanation can there possibly be for the prophet's apparent flip-flop on his predicted outcome of Assyria's descent upon Jerusalem? The answer, according to analysis by Clements and some other experts, is that the real Isaiah was always consistent. He did say Sennacherib would smash Judah and punish her for her people's faithlessness. He appears not to have later changed his mind and said that the emperor's invasion would fail. Isaiah is widely assumed to have died shortly after the Assyrian retreat. At any rate, he left no oracles after the celebration marking that event, and editors probably inserted the latter view posthumously, perhaps a century or more later. The real Isaiah was wrong in predicting that Sennacherib would triumph at Jerusalem, would, and he was consistently wrong, although traditionalist scholars would disagree. His prophecies were far from infallible. Isaiah was right, however, in predicting the devastation of the kingdom of Judah as a whole would suffer. The real Isaiah describes himself as married and as having two sons. So far as his personal beliefs goes, that is about all of which we can be certain. His social and occupational background, as well as the respect or, in some quarters, lack of it that he received in Jerusalem, can only be inferred by his pronouncements. From his remarks concerning Ahaz's reign, we gather that Isaiah at that time enjoyed some influence of the royal court. Many historians assume that his access to the palace stemmed from his origins in the landowning nobility and from his early career, possibly as a government official. His rich use of language and metaphor also suggests a superior education. No other figure of the Old Testament says Clement, shows so commanding a control of the use of irony and wordplay. In order to have attracted the following that he did, Isaiah could not have been, as I first imagined him, an excited misanthropist, a wearying person. Rather, he would have to have had possessed charisma and a bearing that added weight to his articulate, uncompromising criticism of many of mainstream society's premises. Despite his possibly patrician origins, Isaiah became the champion of the underdog. His morality was socially rooted. Yahweh requires his followers, he declared, to stop doing evil and to learn to do right. See the justice is done, help those who are oppressed, give orphans their rights, and defend widows. The message that Yahweh wanted people to live righteously rather than simply go through their motions of ritualistic worship, including the offering of sacrifices, is perhaps the most enduring contribution of Isaiah, and as well of Micah, Judah's other prophet of the period. Micah says Yahweh wants people to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. 27 centuries later, few Jewish Christians or Muslim thinkers will be able to improve on the simple and succinct expressions of that ideal, which remains central to the three faiths. As regards government policy, Isaiah believed that social justice and not aggrandizement of territory and military prowess should be Judah's chief priority. For him, Judah's failure to care for its disadvantaged members and to live righteously was what had caused Yahweh to use Assyria as an instrument of punishment. In the 19th century, French historian Ernest Renan's shrewdly asks, The 19th century French historian Ernest Renan shrewdly asks, Does one not seem to be reading the words of a rabid socialist of our own days, declaiming against the army, making mock of patriotism, predicting with a kind of savage joy future disaster, and summing up his views much as follows: justice for the people, that is the true vengeance, reform society and you will be victorious over your enemies, wherever the poor are victimized, wherever the rich enjoy privileges, there can be no country. Isaiah, it is fair to add, gives these dangerous truths a brilliance which they have never possessed since. The book of Isaiah's most celebrated line among modern advocates of peace and social justice is about how, in an ideal future, people will beat their swords into plowshares. In fact, a respectable body of experts believe that the verse may not be authentic to the 8th century prophet, yet those who cherish the high-minded lines have this consolation. It is thoroughly consistent with his thinking in 701. For him, Hezekiah's struggle against Sennacherib was madness. Hezekiah was a generation younger than Isaiah. Of his personal life we know only little. From his name we see that he would have been raised as a Yahwist. In Hebrew, his name means Yahweh has strengthened, or Yahweh strengthens. He married a woman called Hephzibah. 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 He had at least one son, Manasseh, and more than one daughter. As was normal for the monarchs of many countries in that day, he had concubines. He continued to rule until his death some years after Sennacherib's retreat. The second book of Kings presents Hezekiah as an ideal, unembellished monarch. He trusted in the Lord of Israel, the Lord God of Israel, so that there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah after him, and among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses. As well, the book of 2nd Chronicles extols Hezekiah's zeal in transforming Judah into a profoundly Yahweh society. The book of Isaiah, however, strikes a most discordant note. The passages that may be attributed to the original prophet are never so rash as to mention the king explicitly, but they nonetheless cast a consistently harsh light on his reign. Isaiah castigates the ruling class as a whole. Ah, you who make iniquitous decrees, who write oppressive statutes, to turn aside the needy from justice. He recalls the rulers of Jerusalem, companions. He calls the rulers of Jerusalem companions of thieves. Micah takes on the power structure is also scathing. Micah's take on the power structure is also scathing. City officials and priests alike, he declares, make decisions based on decisions on the basis of graft. City officials and priests alike, he declares, make decisions on the basis of graft. Going even further than Isaiah, he affirms that the rulers of Judah hate good and love evil, and also despise justice and distort all that is right. These rulers, he says, build Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with wickedness. Hard words. There are other reasons for supposing that Hezekiah was hardly an ideal leader. His assumption that Judah could break away from Assyria with impunity was a miscalculation, though whose consequences for the kingdom were nearly catastrophic. As well in the face of many Assyrians, he commanded little loyalty from those around him. Many of Jerusalem's senior army leaders deserted him when Sennacherib first threatened Jerusalem. It is also worth noting that the archaeological evidence suggests that those workers on a major pre-siege construction project regarded the king with something short of adulation. This astonishingly ambitious project is what is today called Hezekiah's Tunnel, or the Siloam Tunnel. This is a 1,750-foot long shaft hacked through Jerusalem's limestone base that, according to the conventional view among scholars, served to deprive the Assyrian besiegers of water from a spring outside of Jerusalem's wall by diverting the water to a reservoir within the walls. Pertinent is an inscription carved into the tunnel's wall by the diggers upon the completion of their labor. The 6-line inscription details the workers' sense of triumph, but there is not a word of reference to the king. In a detailed study of this inscription, one scholar observes that the absence of the king's name is rather extraordinary when the inscription is compared with contemporative royal inscriptions of similar nature from elsewhere in the contemporary Near East, omission of any mention of the sponsor of so successfully of a of the sponsor of so successfully audacious a project seems consistent with the lack of loyalty that the civic leaders in evinced that the civic leaders evinced when they deserted their king. A final reason for doubting Hezekiah's leadership is that the Bible indicates that at some point during the Assyrian invasion, Hezekiah became sick and almost died. The text does not give us enough information to judge whether the illness was psychosomatic or an unfortunate coincidence. In either case, when his kingdom was on the brink of catastrophe, he appears, for good reason or bad, to have provided his people with something less than an exemplary helmsmanship. Hezekiah's arrival on Judah's throne came at roughly the same period as Israel's collapse in 720 BC, perhaps preceding it by several years. The year of ascension is in dispute. A likely date is 727 BC, but it is possible that the new king came to power only several years after Israel's disintegration. The northern neighbor's downfall had several effects on Judah. While it eliminated an occasional invader, it also isolated Judah no longer. While it eliminated an occasional invader, it also isolated Judah no longer. While it eliminated an occasional invader, it also isolated Judah. No longer did it have a senior partner with which, for all the political strains between them, it shared a sense of kinship. And, of course, Israel's demise produced a flow of refugees to the southern kingdom. Archaeological remains tell of Jerusalem's dramatic transformation during the period from a sleepy town into a bustling center. Before Israel's collapse, Jerusalem had a population of only 6,000 to 8,000 people. By the time of the invasion of 701, it may have had 2 or 3 times that number. For lack of space inside the walls, many people had no choice but to build homes beyond them. For Isaiah and Micah, the most important outcome of Israel's obliteration was the religious lesson that it held. Both prophets used the larger kingdom's downfall to bolster their message about the dangers of impiety. Yahweh, they preached, had punished Israel because of its evil ways. They warned that Judah was just a step behind Israel along this disastrous path, and that unless it changed its ways, Yahweh would also destroy the southern kingdom. Composed after the dust had settled from the Assyrian strife, the book of 2 Kings develops this theme. Its back-to-back account of the invasion of Israel in 722 to 720 and Judah in 701 reflected the Deuteronomic view that sinners suffer but the pious prosper. 2 Kings describes how prior to the Assyrian onslaught, the people of Israel built themselves high places that is hilltop altars for the worship of gods other than Yahweh. They also set up pillars and sacred poles of the fertility cult, did evil things, angering Yahweh, and abandoned all the commands of the deity, so that the god deployed Assyria to bring punitive ruination to their kingdom. It describes Hezekiah only some 20 verses later. 2 Kings, in describing Hezekiah only some 20 verses later, 2 Kings employs the same element to dramatize the differences in the two kingdoms' theological performances. This literary device might be called the contrasting parallel. The text says that Judah's monarch abolished the high places, broke the sacred pillars, and cut down the poles of Asherah. In Yahweh, God of Israel, he put his trust. There was no one like him among all the kings of Judah following him, or among those before him. He was loyal to Yahweh. He did not turn away from him, but kept the commands which Yahweh had given Moses. And so Yahweh was with him in all that he undertook. He was successful. Emphasis added. The Bible indicates that this religious reform would have taken place before, not after the invasion, so that the deliverance was in response to it. Second Kings alludes to another aspect of the king's religious reform. It says that Hezekiah ordered the demolition of altars and shrines to Yahweh scattered around the kingdom. To Yahweh scattered around the kingdom, with the sole exception of Jerusalem's temple. The king told the people of Judah and Jerusalem to worship only at the altar in Jerusalem. Elsewhere, the Bible presents Hezekiah's centralization of the Yahweh's cult at the temple and his successful exhortation to all Judahites and people of the former territories of Israel to worship there. As one of his defining acts of greatness, the measure gave Mount Zion unprecedented religious importance. Most conventional historians accept the idea that Hezekiah carried out a religious reform that was significant but less thorough than the Bible presents it. If they are right in saying that at least some historical foundation exists for the Bible's assertion that Hezekiah centralized the worship of Yahweh at the temple, they are probably also right in suggesting that this would have carried unmistakable political ramifications. The temple was within a few yards of the royal palace. Tadmore suggests confidently that Hezekiah's elevation of the temple as a sole legitimate place could in part have been a calculated move to consolidate his control over the cult and priesthood. For Hezekiah, all this would have meant increased wealth. Carl D. Evans of the University of South Carolina says that the centralization of worship would have had the effect of placing additional resources under the king's control, enhancing the royal treasury, and providing the occasion for creating an administrative system to handle the increased contributions. Yet it is not easy to embrace the idea of Hezekiah's Yahweh's alone piety. For one thing, Isaiah makes no mention of it. For another, the Bible elsewhere makes a statement that is hard to square with the notion that Hezekiah was exclusively devoted to Yahweh. Shortly after hailing Hezekiah for tearing down pagan construction, 2 Kings tells us that it was King Josiah, Hezekiah's grandson, who dared to take the decisive step of destroying those pagan altars that Solomon had built for his foreign wives. If Hezekiah had crusaded against polytheism, it is astonishing that he would have missed these. The altars to foreign deities would have been located just outside the city walls on the Mount of Olives, within view of the royal palace. Archaeology also raises questions about Hezekiah's religious reform. In an article published in 1995, Nadav Naaman of Tel Aviv University, Department of Jewish History, says, archaeological evidence shows that a cultic shrine in Lachish apparently remained intact until the town's conquest by Sennacherib. This is an indication of the non-reliability of the text, according to which Hezekiah removed the cult, i.e., 2 Kings 18:4 to 22, according to which Hezekiah removed the cult places from all the towns of Judah. Naaman also sees an absence of clear archaeological evidence for any cultic reform mentioned in the Bible, and concludes that the execution of a wide-ranging reform by Hezekiah is doubtful. Biblical writers of later generations, he suggests, credited Hezekiah with a sweeping religious reform as a means of explaining why Yahweh spared Jerusalem from sharing the same disastrous destiny as Israel. Even though the archaeological record is too spotty to demolish totally the notion of Hezekiah as a comprehensive reformer, Naaman's view is eminently plausible. Still more doubtful than the idea of Hezekiah as a great ecclesiastical centralizer is the supposition that his so-called religious reform would have stressed good works. Isaiah and Micah excoriate the religious establishment for its emphasis on sacrifice and ritual, and bemoan its total inattention to righteous behavior. It is nonsense to contend, as do some historians, that Hezekiah was a social reformer. Not even the most idealizing passages on Hezekiah in 2 Kings or 2 Chronicles make mention of any social reforms. One thing that would certainly have improved improved under Hezekiah, however, is the level of Judahite society's dynamism. Israel had been, of course, the more prosperous and sophisticated of the Hebrew kingdoms, and while war would have impoverished many of its post-720 refugees to Judah, other immigrants would have brought considerable wealth with them. Property prices in Judah would have risen accordingly. During Hezekiah's reign, artists, writers, and other talented Israelites among these refugees might well have contributed to an unusually high standard of culture. The new spirit of confidence would also show itself in an assertive nationalism. Under Ahaz, the state had been able to cape the widespread public sentiment favoring greater independence from Assyria. Now under Hezekiah, that would change. Early in his reign, Hezekiah, like his father before him, treated Assyria with great deference. Thus, in 716, when the imperial army swept through Philistia as far as the Egyptian border, Sargon paid Judah no attention. The little kingdom was well behaved. In 713, however, when some of the nearby Philistines rebelled, Judah showed signs of restiveness. In that year, the leader of the coastal Philistine city of Ashdod, Imani, formed a coalition of coastal states that rebelled against Assyrian rule. An inscription by Sargon tells of how Ashdod also looked inland for help, sending to Judah, Edom, and Moab numberless inflammatory and disdainful messages to set them at enmity with me and join the revolt. That Judah was tempted to join is clear from Isaiah's desperate and prolonged nakedness campaign to rally public opinion against the rebellion. As we saw earlier, however, Hezekiah in the end did not participate, and Sargon spared Judah the lash. The empire quickly crushed the coastal rebellion, forcing Imani to flee to Egypt. Again, the Assyrian army advanced as far as the Egyptian border, yet Hezekiah's dream of enlarging his kingdom did not abate. When his son was born in 710, it may be significant that the king named him Manasseh, the name of one of the more prominent northern tribes. Was also Manasseh, and one scholar plausibly suggests that for Hezekiah to name his son and successor, as it turned out, after it, could have implied the hope of making political inroads among the people of that tribe's traditional territory. At roughly this time, perhaps a few years after his son's birth, Hezekiah employed military force to expand his territory. 2 Kings says of Hezekiah, he rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. He attacked the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory, from watchtower to fortified city. Another source, an Assyrian document, indicates that among the seizures by Hezekiah was the large fortified Philistine city of Gath, best remembered today as the hometown of David's foe in the biblical giant Goliath. Judah's annexation of the Gaza territory may not have reflected a policy of territorial aggrandizement for its own sake, but rather a strategy of trying to neutralize bastions of Assyrian support within Kor. Why did Hezekiah show such bold confidence in defy mighty Assyria? In 705, the dreaded Sargon had died. His son Sennacherib, crowned the following year, was an unknown quantity. After the death of the two previous Assyrian kings, Tiglath-Pileser in 727 and Shalmaneser in 722, many territories under the imperial yoke, including Israel on both occasions, had similarly sensed weakness and rebelled. If the unsuccessful outcome of those revolts offered a cautionary lesson for Judah, it was ignored. The circumstances of Sargon's death may have helped shed light on Hezekiah's motivation to rebel. The emperor was killed in battle far from Assyria, and his body never recovered. That the ancients often saw such an event as a dire omen of the deceased leader's side may have helped embolden Judah. Another important factor is that Judah's action was an abundant Judah's action was an abundance of allies. Another important factor in Judah's action was an abundance of allies, something that had not been the case in the earlier Ashdodite rebellion. After Sargon's death, one militarily powerful ally may have been Babylon. Its king, Merodach Baladan, may have sent diplomatic envoys to Jerusalem at about this time. Many historians plausibly argue that Babylonia, Assyrian's strongest enemy, was encouraging revolt at different points in the empire to overload Nineveh's military capabilities. In addition, Judah found allies within Kor itself. Two peoples lived among Kor's coast. To the south, in what is today Western Israel, were the Philistines. The latest theory is that they came to Kor from the Aegean world in perhaps the 13th century BC. The Philistines quickly became acculturated and within several generations appear to have adopted much of the native Canaanite language and religion. Philistia never became a unified state. Rather, it was organized on the basis of 5 distinct city-states, each with rural territory. Historians call the 5-city league the Philistine Pentapolis. In the context of the crisis of 701, what is pertinent is that the Philistines had a tradition of military competence, and that four out of the league's 5 members now became part of the anti-Syrian coalition. Ekron and Ashkelon were willing partners, while Hezekiah's annexation of Gaza and Gath had brought those cities into the rebellion. Only the 5th, the freshly humbled Ashdod, remained submissive to Assyria. The other people on Kor's coast were the Phoenicians, who lived in what is today, roughly speaking, Lebanon. Racially and culturally, they were Canaanites. Their cities, like those of the Philistines, were not united. Phoenicia's principal cities enjoyed spectacular success in commerce, strategically located as they were major trade routes for Mesopotamia, Egypt, Arabia, and the Mediterranean converged. The rebellion offered the king of Tyre, one of the principal city-states, the opportunity to shake himself free of Assyrian control. This king, named Luli, also controlled nearby Sidon, a second major Phoenician maritime center, and would have been a leading figure in the eastern Mediterranean world. The Judahites were evidently torn between joining the coalition and steering clear of it. Renan, writing more than a century ago on the basis of clues from the book of Isaiah, had laid out a vivid, plausible scenario for the political clash that no other scholar, to my knowledge, either challenged or improved upon. He sees a polarization consisting of 2 informal groupings or parties. Quote, in Jerusalem, the military and patriotic party urged that an opportunity which they regarded as excellent should not be lost for crushing the standing danger of the freedom of the East. This military party appeared to have been almost indifferent to matters of religion. They were not at all events Yahwehist of the Reformed school. They were hard, perhaps unjust, towards the people, as aristocrats so often are. In striking contrast to them, like white upon black, stood out the party of democratic theocracy and of religious Puritanism, opposed to the lay state and to military precautions. Being intent solely upon the religious and social reforms. Unquote. According to this hawk-dove scenario, the military party, rebuffed during Ahaz's reign, would likely have seen its numbers and influence soar, while the arrival of refugees, including wealthy and patrician ones from the northern kingdom, were a muscular stance towards Assyria had long prevailed. A modern analogy might be the truculence of some Cuban emigres who fled to southern Florida after Fidel Castro's communist takeover of their homeland in 1960. Resentful of being deposed of their property, they sought to enlist the help of the country that they had fled to, in this case the United States, to regain their homeland. Israelite refugees may have found support in their host societies, since many wealthy Judaites would have rankled under the tribute that Assyria demanded of them. Isaiah would have been close to the Dove Party, but not all doves would have agreed with his theological reasoning. For Isaiah, Judah's priority should be internal reform, namely the creation of a righteous society. If the kingdom could be so, Yahweh would bless it and keep it safe and prosperous. If Judah continued to do too little to reform itself internally, Yahweh's punishment, which the Assyrian juggernaut was prepared to inflict, would descend upon it. Some doves would doubtless have been against rebellion for largely pragmatic reasons. As Israel's experience had attested, provoking Assyria could be counterproductive to the extreme. The anti-rebellion party also might have been concerned by Judah's complicity in the event that Nineveh would have seen a particularly Nineveh would have seen as particularly as outrageous. Assyria had earlier appointed a man named Paddi as ruler of Ekron. In 702, the people of the city deposed the puppet. Instead of executing him, however, they had him taken to Jerusalem for imprisonment. The ruler who had replaced Paddi became one of the coalition's leaders. Paddy's arrival to Jerusalem for incarceration must have further inflamed the debate. What was Sennacherib's role in all of this? The consensus among historians is that what was Hezekiah's role in all of this? The consensus among historians is that Hezekiah was the rebellion's leader, yet no one, to my knowledge, has presented supporting evidence. The idea of Hezekiah as a ringleader reflects an inflated idea of Judah's standing in core. It appears to be one of those views that, repeated often enough, takes on a life of its own. To mount a credible case that Hezekiah was the leader, one would have to explain why King Luli of Tyre, in particular, was not. Luli was the head of a major commercial center whose far-flung trade was evidently suffering from Assyria's interference. It is hard to imagine the worldly Phoenician city-states playing second fiddle to what they would have considered to be the rustic, relatively underdeveloped, militarily modest kingdom of Judah. It is safer to consider that Judah to have been a fairly important member of the coalition, or at best possibly a leader, but almost certainly not the leader. It is also more in keeping with Hezekiah's lack of a commanding personality. My assumption is that a vigorous hawk party, its strength augmented by immigrants from the former northern kingdom who had lost their property to Assyria, urged Judah to join breakaway movements in other vassal states. Hezekiah, weak monarch that he was, did not lead this current within his own country, much less in core as a whole. Rather, the current carried him. The coalition's judgment of their new Assyrian lord's character and abilities was grossly off the mark. Before taking power, Sennacherib already had considerable military and administrative experience. He was able to get off on a strong start. We have far more reliable information about Sennacherib's career than about Hezekiah's. Like all Assyrian kings, he described his reign in his annals, the monarch's yearly account of his principal achievements. The annals make it clear that upon his coming to power in 704 BC, Sennacherib aimed to show that he would run the empire in his father's iron-fisted style, and then some. In his military campaign, which took place in 703 and early 702, he defeated the combined forces of Babylon and their Elamite Elamite ally. He claimed to have conquered and looted 75 of his strong walled cities of Chaldea and 420 small cities of their ever, of their environs. It is noteworthy that in his maiden campaign, Sennacherib applied his predecessor's policy of deporting recalcitrant inhabitants of conquered territories on a large scale. In his second campaign, which took place in 702 BC, Sennacherib appears to have hit cruising speed. He quelled the defying Kazites, hunting them down in the rugged Zagros Mountains of present-day western Iran, and again deporting many of the survivors and replacing them with settlers from elsewhere. Were the rest of vassals of Kor paying attention? Even if they were, the revolt had probably already passed the point of no return. By 702, Hezekiah's grab of territory held by loyal Assyrian vassals and the Ekronites' overthrow of Padi, Assyria's man, would likely have taken place. What kind of overlord was it that Judah and its allies were provoking? What was his character? The annals are revealing. They present Sennacherib as someone with, to put it mildly, an exalted sense of self. In addition to calling himself King of the Universe, his other favorite names included Perfect Hero, first among all princes, and the flame that consumes the insubmissive. He who strikes the wicked with the thunderbolt, and favorite of the great gods. His flair for architecture reflects this self-image. A year after his withdrawal from Jerusalem, he started to build his new capital city, Nineveh, and strove to make it even more impressive than his father's capital, Der Sharukin, or Sargonsburg. Nineveh's centerpiece was the palace without rival, a 70-room edifice that was the Versailles of the ancient world. With such features as human-headed stone bulls 18 feet high guarding doors, and with a throne room 55 yards in length. The scale and magnificence of the building was in part designed, as one expert puts it, to reinforce visiting foreign leaders' inclination to submit. Rereading that part. With such features as human-headed stone bulls 18 feet high guarding doors, and with a throne room 55 yards in length, the scale and magnificence of the building was in part designed, as one expert puts it, to reinforce visiting foreign leaders' inclination to submit. Despite his taste for luxury, Sennacherib was no softy, no royal state at home who let his generals earn his glory for him. The emperor accompanied his armies everywhere. In his 702 campaign against the Kazites, for example, he was forced to abandon the royal chariot and travel by horse in those days when saddles lacked stirrups and consisted of little more than padding. This required excellent riding skill, particularly on steep inclines. He writes, "In the midst of the high mountains, I rode on horseback where the terrain was difficult, and had my chariot drawn up on ropes up the mountainsides. Where it became too steep, I clambered upon foot like the wild ox." In some campaigns, the land was far too rugged for chariots to be of any use at all. In such cases, Sennacherib would use the sedan chair, a covered seat borne on poles by muscular men, the ancient counterpart of the general's jeep. Here, several years after the 701 conflict, he gives the swaggering but poignant account of his campaign against hill tribes east of the Tigris River. Quote, "I had my camp pitched on the foot of Mount Nippur, and with my picked bodyguards and my relentless warriors, I, like a strong wild ox, led the way. Gullies, mountain torrents and waterfalls, dangerous cliffs I surmounted in my sedan chair. Where it was too steep for my chair, I advanced on foot. Like a young gazelle, I mounted the highest peaks in pursuit of them. Whenever my knees gave out, I sat down, and on some mountain boulders I drank the cold water from the water skin to quench my thirst. To the summits of the mountains I pursued them and brought about their overthrow. This is not an emperor who presents himself as a superman, but as a human, hard-working commander who leads men through the strains and frustrations of military operations. The contrast between Sennacherib and Hezekiah is sharp. The Bible frequently describes other kings of Judah or Israel in battlefield situations, often giving unstinting praise to their martial leadership. Yet, while the Bible tells how during Hezekiah's reign Judah enlarged its territory by military means, never does it show the king himself as remotely near a battle. King versus king, the conflict of 701 BC was no contest. Sennacherib not only welcomes combat, he positively gloats on the horrors that his men inflict on the enemy. In a disturbing description of a battle against Elam several years after his withdrawal from Kor, he cherishes a grisly series of scenes that escalates into bloodshed, into bloodlust. Quote, Humbanu Dasha, the field marshal of the king of Elam, the trustworthy commander of his armies, his chief support together with his nobles. Speedily I cut them down and established their defeat. I cut their throats like lambs. I cut off their precious lives as one cuts a string. Like the many waters of a storm, I made the contents of their gullets and entrails run down upon the wide earth. My prancing steeds, harnessed for my riding, plunged into the streams of their blood as into a river. The wheels of my war chariot, which brings low the wicked and the evil, were besplattered with blood and filth. With the bodies of their warriors I filled the plain like grass. Their testicles I cut off and tore out their privates like the seeds of cucumbers of June. Their hands I cut off. Julius Caesar's most famous line, used as he recounted his military exploits in Gaul, is, I came, I saw, and I conquered. 6 centuries before, Sennacherib wrote down this line about his campaign against the Kassites in the Zagros Mountains. I destroyed, I devastated, I turned into ruins. Such was the mentality of the young emperor who would next turn his attention to Kor.